Hello, everyone. I want to thank you for coming out today and to announce that we have one more session in this series. So we have Natalie Ton coming back next week to talk to us about the forests. And then we'll be on hiatus during winter quarter, but we will have another series up in spring. So if you want to keep an eye on our website at lowercolumbia.edu/conversations, that's where to go for more information. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Danielle Casey.
All right. Hi. So welcome. We are talking about origami today. Come on in. Come on in. We are talking about origami today. It is my favorite thing on the planet. So to get started, this is the part where I do the introduction thing. I am going to tell you more about my story as we go along. You'll learn more about me. So to start, all you really need to know about me is, aside from a brief 6-month stint I did in South St. Paul, Minnesota, I've lived here my whole life. And this is my favorite thing. I live in Longview with my cats and my husband, and I could probably give a whole lecture about how wonderful all of them are. But for now, we're going to talk about origami. So the first thing, a lot of folks know that origami's origin is in Japan. The actual etymology of the word, the way it breaks down, ori means to fold and kami means paper. That's not a typo. It is a K and not a G. The human tongues are lazy in every language, and over time, that K sound turned into a G to bring us the word that we know as origami today. So before we start, I'm going to run you through kind of what we're going to do here. So we're in our introduction phase right now. After this, we're going to talk about some history of origami, where things started, and then a little bit about modern history, starting in about the 1950s. After that, we're going to talk about science, medicine, and words I really can't pronounce, all of the fun connections to science and technology and medicine that origami has had. And then we're going to talk about types of origami. This is where I'm going to show you some stuff I hope you've never seen before because it's super, super neat. And then I'm going to tell you my story, and we're going to have some casual destruction. I am going to take one of these models over here, this guy in particular. We'll bring him over here for our camera folks. I'm going to toss this up in the air, smack it like a volleyball, and we're going to watch it pop into a bunch of pieces. Yes. Okay. So before we get to the good stuff, for anybody who is online, you can't see all the pretty models that are on the tables here in the room. Towards the end of this, everyone's going to get access to a fun, like a resource guide if you want to start doing origami that's full of recommendations and tips and information. I probably put too much time into it, but I love it so much. And then in that same resource guide, you'll have a link to a photo gallery. It's just a Google Drive folder, but it has pictures of all of the models that are in the room and then some extra ones that I've got in there as well. So let me check my notes here. Okay. When we get to the end, folks who are in person, I want you to take the models that are on the table and take them with you. I make these constantly. You are doing me a favor by taking them because I run out of room for them. And why I love this so much really is sharing it. So start looking around, think about what you want, take more than one. They're delightful. Tell everybody about them. Okay, so let's get started. We start with our history lesson. So this all starts with a guy named Sai Lun, some Buddhist monks, and one of the most important human inventions ever. So some of you are like, I'm sure, presentation connoisseurs, and you're not really a fan of when people just read directly off their slides. I am going to do that in parts of this because it makes it easier for some folks to follow along, but I promise it's not going to be just me reading for 50 minutes. So we start in 105 AD, which is over 2,100 years ago. So a Chinese court official named Sai Lun, the aforementioned guy, invented paper in about 105 AD, and then Buddhist monks would later bring the invention to Japan. So here's where we introduce a concept that is going to show up a total of 3 times, and that is the nature of who gets credit for an invention. Sai Lun is most commonly credited with inventing paper, but the farther back in history you go, anytime you say somebody invented something, there is a gaggle of people ready to say like, maybe, allegedly. So the popular story is that Sai Lun came up with it, but it's very possible it was actually invented much earlier, and he only received credit for it because of his place in the Chinese court at the time. And so all the way into the 1600s, but likely earlier, because this is like 1700 years after the invention of paper, Origami begins in Japan. It begins in Japan in the 1600s, and it is first limited to ceremonial applications because paper is expensive, and the cost meant that origami functioned as a symbol of social class. Now, what this means is that the only people who did origami were high-ranking nobles and high-ranking soldiers because paper, like, it had just started. Now it's one of the most affordable things on the planet, but then extremely expensive, and so it was held as a status symbol of your class. Now, a quick shout out to a poem about an origami butterfly from 1680. One of the things historically that folks point to as evidence that it's likely that origami existed in Japan before the 1600s is a very specific poem in 1680 that referenced origami butterflies so specifically and so ubiquitously, like they were just a cultural facet at the time, that it seems unlikely that they had taken root like in the last 80 years. Like it's really... The history of paper folding art is pretty all over the place. It's hard to find documentation on stuff. I just really love that we have a poem from 1680 about origami butterflies. So in the period that follows this, from the 1600s to about the mid-1800s, throughout the Edo period, as manufacturing techniques were refined and paper-making technology spread, the cost of paper dropped, expanding the art form. So like we get better methods of making it, we decide on different materials, all sorts of things change in that time, and we expand to where it's more available to everyone. And during this time, the way it's actually most commonly used was for wrappers. Wrappers is a really general term for origami that was used to like wrap gifts or foodstuffs and given as like presents to friends and family and associates. So then we reach 1853. 1853 is important specifically because Japan ends its isolationist foreign policy in 1853, allowing influences from the rest of the world like European napkin folding and the paper folding pedagogy of the German kindergartens to weave their way into the art form. Now this, we most commonly associate origami with Japan, but paper folding and really like European napkin folding, the art of folding flat things into shaped things, it popped up in all sorts of places. We're going to talk a little bit later about the Chinese paper folding tradition. It's really a global art form, a wonder of the world. And don't worry, that was not a throwaway reference to the German kindergarten. That's actually immediately what we're going to talk about. This is Friedrich Froebel. And Friedrich Froebel lived from 1782 to 1852, lived to 70 years old. And Friedrich Froebel, inventor of the kindergarten, was a strong believer in the use of paper folding and weaving and cutting to help with early childhood development. So you'll notice I'm going to talk about a couple of other folks that are pretty long-lived. Origami has actually been shown to help stave off Alzheimer's. And I would love to like sell you the lie that it's just origami that does this. It's not. It is the act of keeping your mind and your body engaged and continuing to practice those fine motor skills as we age. So Friedrich Froebel is also commonly associated with these. So these are called Froebel stars, and they are a form of strip folding. So these are depicted on this background of these strips of paper because that's what they're made out of. They're strips that are folded on themselves and like tied into this intricate knot. They're often used as Christmas decorations. Friedrich Froebel almost certainly did not invent them. They were more just named after him. All right, so that was our very brief past history. Now we move on to modern origami. Now this is the father of modern origami, Akira Yoshizawa. He is a fascinating figure. Here are some of his works. He's most known, at least if you look into him, like one of his most common models are these gorillas, but he had models ranging all sorts of categories, mostly representational origami. And we're going to talk a little bit about what representational origami is, but really it's just origami that represents things, animals, boats, houses, like all sorts of stuff. If it represents a like object, it's representational origami. So Akira Yoshizawa lived from March 14th, 1911 to March 14th, 2005. That's 94 years old. Interesting, like that's not a typo. He was born and died on the same day, March 14th. And Yoshizawa came from pretty humble beginnings, leaving school at age 13 to work in a factory. He would leave the factory in his late 20s to pursue origami, going on to create some 50,000 models throughout his lifetime. So that 50,000 number is by his own estimation. Uh, one of my favorite fun facts about him is that when he left the factory, because he started as a factory line worker and then moved into draftsman work, and his like mind for origami and for geometry really helped him in that. But he decided he wanted to pursue the art full time, so he left. And for the next 20-ish years, before World War II happened, the next 20-ish years, he was a door-to-door condiment salesman. He sold a Japanese condiment made of seaweed, whose name I don't remember, to like just folks to try to get by. He was your stereotypical starving artist. And now he never sold his models. He instead gave them away as gifts and let others borrow them for exhibitions. And what I find most inspiring about Yoshizawa is that he folded his entire life. He started very, very young. And even on his deathbed in hospice care, he was making models for his caregivers. During World War II, he was a medical officer in Hong Kong and was known for making models for sick patients before he was eventually sent back to Japan because he himself was injured. So he did this his whole life. And he wasn't just a master of the art, he solved the single largest problem facing the world of origami, diagramming. So all right, let's move on to the next slide just to make sure we can keep this where I want to go. The Yoshizawa Randlet system is what it's called. I have a very brief image here of the first bit of notation. So one of the things that is most brilliant about origami is that you don't need to understand language to understand the diagrams, because with Yoshizawa, he came up with this system that was just universal. If you've ever done origami before, you've seen this system. It is the indication of your mountain folds and your valley folds, those two most common folds in origami, and some of the other basic notations that we still see in all sorts of books and like places today. Super, super neat. So the way this starts, in 1954, Yoshizawa's diagramming system is introduced in Atarashi Origami Geijutsu, his first book. I am doing my best with pronunciations. I do apologize if we have any speakers of the language in this room that realize that I just butchered that. I'm gonna do what I can. And then in 1961, Samuel Randlet described his additions to the system in his book, Art of Origami. So over these couple of years, this period in like the mid to late 50s is really important for this art form in the United States, especially. So often when you look at this like information about this system, there are plenty of folks who will include a guy named Harbin. His last name's Harbin. I could not find any substantive information about what exactly Harbin contributed to this system, but his name is out there sometimes. This is the second place that concept of invention shows up, though, because in my research about this, I found a really delightful article, really long, well-researched article from a group of folks at Origami USA and Origami Society here in the United States, going over all the reasons they think Yoshizawa probably didn't actually come up with this entirely. There are lots of ways to prove that, maybe he's absolutely the person who popularized it, but he had inspiration from others. There are writings before this system was introduced in 1954 that refer to terms that are used in this system that we attribute to him, but appeared earlier. But either way, this is part of why origami is absolutely a wonder of the world, because you don't need language to understand it. If you understand the diagramming system, you can fold things folded by people who don't share a word of language with you. So for those in the room, yes, I've got all these books at the front that I would love to invite you to come take a look at when we're done here. One of these books, Origami Tempo, is written entirely in Portuguese, but I have folded many models from it because you don't actually need the language to understand them. So all over the world. All right. So why do we call it origami? It's because of a lady named Lillian Oppenheimer, no relation to the other Oppenheimer. Here's a picture of her in an article in the New York Times. So why I've got this question here, why do we call it origami? Origami is very different from other art forms in that its name itself stays the same across most languages. Painting is not painting in every language. Sculpting is not sculpting in every language. Origami is origami in most every language. And part of why it is that, actually the largest reason that's credited why it is called origami in English, is this woman, Lillian Oppenheimer. Now, she lived from 1898 to 1992. That's 93 years. And Oppenheimer's career in origami didn't begin until the late 50s, 1950s, when she herself was in her 50s. She's broadly credited with popularizing the art form in the United States and in conjunction with artists like Argai Yoshizawa, transforming origami into a more organized art form. And what I mean by more organized is really just that the artists were talking to each other. It wasn't being practiced in isolation. We were seeing these big communities that spanned sometimes across nations to form around this art. So prior to Oppenheimer's efforts in the United States, we just called it paper folding. But she found that term to be uninteresting and easily confused with other paper crafts. And her work cemented the term origami in the English language. So we're going to come back to this part of the story later, stick a bookmark in this, into her deciding that she wanted to use the term origami because paper folding was just uninteresting. Because there's another term she considered but didn't choose that we're going to talk about in a while. But how did she have the power to do this? Well, we were super into origami in the 1950s, especially the late 50s, which also happened to be when television was taking off. The New York Times printed an article about her to massive success, leading her to appear on multiple talk shows, both via radio and television. So she would also go on to form one of the very first origami centers in the United States in New York City. I find this article particularly fun because of the caption, because this was still at a time when she wasn't called Lillian Oppenheimer, she was Mrs. Harry C. Oppenheimer. But her name is Lillian. She was active in the origami community until her death in 1992. And she is the reason we call it origami in the United States. And the US exports nothing quite as well as we export culture. She's largely credited with why many other European English-speaking countries call it origami as well. All right. So there is our really brief flash history lesson. We're going to move on to the science, medicine, and words I can't pronounce part. Okay, so my warning here, don't ask me too many really specific technical questions. These are not my field of expertise, but I'm going to tell you more about what kind of stuff is in the resource guide at the end for you to kind of do some discovery on your own if you'd like to. So we're going to start with the James Webb Space Telescope. How many of you are familiar with the James Webb Space Telescope? Yeah, it's one of the coolest things on the planet. So it's not on the planet anymore. That's kind of its whole point. So this image in particular is of a particular structure called the Pillars of Creation. And it's a structure that the Hubble telescope also photographed and is often used in comparison images between the Hubble and the James Webb Space Telescope. I didn't include both because I think it's kind of rude to the Hubble to always be like, hey, you suck. It was an incredibly important feat at the time it came out. James Webb is just much larger. And now James Webb is one of humanity's biggest go big or go home moments. Here's some brief information about the telescope. It cost $10 billion and took 30 years to build. And let that sink in for a second, because that means that there are folks who worked on this, who worked for sometimes decades of their lives and passed away before it was completed. This took as long as I've been alive to build. It cost an ridiculous amount of money, way over budget. It cost so much that it had some fun bits of lore to it. During its time being built, it was housed in Houston, Texas for a while. And it was housed in Houston, Texas during Hurricane Harvey. And the floodwaters were super bad. But the research team, okay, it's also a real dramatic piece of equipment. It has to be kept at the most pristine conditions. The clean room that it was kept in cost $10 million a month to keep running because it had to be spotless, not a speck of dust, kept at extremely temperature controlled conditions, had to stay extremely cold. So Hurricane Harvey shows up and the research team's like, you know what? We're really worried we're about to run out of liquid nitrogen and cause billions of dollars worth of damage to this equipment. So they had to really pressure the liquid nitrogen suppliers to drive through floodwaters to get them this liquid nitrogen as a matter of national importance because we had made such a big investment in it. And one of the reasons it's such an impressive feat, it had exactly one chance for successful deployment a million miles from Earth. If this didn't work the first time, it was going to be a complete loss because again, a million miles away, it has no people there. Even out in space, we know what it looks like, but the folks who monitored this post-launch, all they had were essentially screens full of numbers telling them what the instruments were doing as it tried to align itself. So origami was a vital part of the engineering process, not just in determining how best to fold fold the mirrors themselves, but the layered sun shield as well. So here's what most folks know the James Webb Space Telescope looks like. So these are its mirrors, these gold hexagonal plates here. And then this at the bottom here is its sun shield, these layered sheets. So the reason it needed a sun shield, again, same reason it needed the liquid nitrogen, it has to stay extremely cold. The difference, what this sun shield is capable of doing is reducing the temperature between this side and this side by 540 degrees Fahrenheit. It's so sensitive that even a million miles away, the heat from our sun and earth and moon would have messed with this too much for it to work because it's an infrared telescope. But we see this image of it a lot. What we don't see is this one. This telescope had to fold up. It had to fold up perfectly to fit in the rocket. I believe it was the Ariane rocket that shot it off into space. And it had to be able to unfold and deploy by itself. So the team that worked on this talked to so many different folks trying to get ideas about how we fold this up correctly. And in the end, like they consulted with a guy named Robert J. Lang, who is an extremely prominent engineer and origami artist who ultimately helped devise the final solution for this. So in the resource guide at the end, there are a couple of different links about the telescope, including an article from Quanta magazine that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2022 for explanatory research writing. Very, very worth the read. If you're at all interested in this telescope, absolutely give it a shot. But there's also stuff from NASA themselves, including diagrams if you want to fold your own version of the mirror that, for me, kind of boring, but if you're really into the space, super neat. Okay, so now we get to some medical stuff I don't fully understand but think is cool. So this was a draft slide title. I wrote this one evening and was like, I'll come back and come up with something more professional for this. But when I came back to it, I realized, nope, this is what the slide is. This is the most accurate title. So we start with this internal injury patch, which is, it's hard to see from a distance, but there are these little perforations throughout this patch, I'll just read you about it. MIT students designed this patch to fold around existing medical tools for use sealing wounds in minimally invasive surgical procedures. When it makes contact with wet tissues or organs, it turns into a stretchy gel. So in the in the resource guide, there's a link to the MIT News article about this and a direct link to a video that's less than 2 minutes long of the research team talking about why this is important and how it works. So minimally invasive procedures are things like laparoscopic surgery. If you've had your gallbladder removed in the last 10, 15 years, you've had a surgery like this, where teeny tiny incisions are made to do all the work they need to do inside your body. The problem with those procedures is it makes it really hard to seal up internal wounds. And these were designed to help solve that problem. Very much worth watching the video about them. And then we have the OPAD. So before I read you what exactly it does, to explain kind of what this image is, it's a sheet of paper that is cut a little bit and folded up on itself and treated with special wax ink. And it functions kind of like a pregnancy test. Some biological matter gets dropped on it, it soaks through the paper, and when it's unfolded, it helps detect disease. So this device, designed by chemists at the University of Texas at Austin, is made of folded paper. It's used to detect a multitude of diseases, including malaria and HIV, and it only costs about 10 cents to make. So the one bummer I have to tell you about this is that this is first mentioned, the first research article I was able to find about this was about 12 years ago. So very little recent information about this technology. The unfortunate thing about the scientific community is it's not always the best inventions that get funded. So no idea where the future of this project is going, if anywhere, but it was too neat for me not to mention. All right, so a list of other stuff. One of the articles in our in the resource guide is to a little bit more technical article detailing some of the ways origami has interacted with medicine in particular. So I'm gonna read you some highlights of what's in that particular article. Tissue scaffolds have been influenced by origami. That's regenerative medicine. They're the kinds of things that are put in your body to help regrow tissues. Drug delivery approaches, so designing more effective pills and capsules, stents, catheters, and implants. Surgical tools, kind of like this injury patch, and microfluidic devices and biosensors, which are things like the OPAD. If you have questions about any of those things, go to the LCC directory, type in chemistry or biology, and pick a name. I'm kidding. Don't do that unless you're going to email a guy named Armando Herbelin. You tell him I sent you. Okay, so there is our science and medicine. Before I keep going, do I have any questions right now? I know I talk kind of fast. There will be a spot for questions at the end. Cool. Okay, Now we're getting into my favorite part of the show, types of origami. So I mentioned we've got representational origami. So categorizing origami is a little bit difficult. Broadly falls into two categories. Representational origami, those models that most of us have seen before, like the cranes and the boats, and also modular origami, which is what you've got in front of you right now, what this model up here is. That's origami that none of these models in front of you are a single sheet of paper. They're 30 sheets of paper folded in the exact same way and woven together. So let's talk about some of these. So first, let me show you what ceremonial origami looked like. So you've got a little bit of reference of where we've come from. So these models here are some of the oldest I could find images of. Hard to determine what many of these were used for, but these here are examples of those wrappers, those gift wrappers, often used to hold flowers and other like greenery. And so these are more diagrams of them. These are pictures of the actual models themselves, but they were also used for things like decorations. This model here likely was a hanging ornament of some sort. And this down here is kind of a crease pattern that is very much incomplete of how it was made. So that's where we start from. Let's see where we're going. We'll start with some of our representational origami. Now, wet folding is not a type so much as it is a technique. Remember back to our guy, Akira Yoshizawa. He might not have invented that system of notation, but he most certainly came up with this technique. Wet folding is very much exactly what it sounds like. It's getting paper wet so that you can make more curved folds. So here's some of the things that makes. So you have like this oxen model, these owls, that lion there. This absolutely beautiful, this unicorn's probably my favorite of them, or the foxes there. So very, very different. It's absolutely kind of an advanced technique, but it's so cool. Like if you just Google wet folding, you'll find so many pictures of absolutely phenomenal works of art. So a side note here, I am very sorry that I don't have my images in like the perfect formatting and these like nice little borders and circles and what have you. I couldn't bring myself to like scrape through the internet to find the perfect sized images. I just wanted to show you neat stuff. All right, so wet folding, spectacular advanced form of representational origami. And then we move on to strip folding. So this, of course, I chose to immediately veer from the traditional. Strip folding is what we saw with the Froebel star. Froebel stars are also called Moravian stars, is another name for them as Christmas decorations. But strip folding has many forms. So these roses here, if any of you have ever seen, when I've seen these before, it's for folks like folding up paper straw wrappers to make these. If you've ever seen these happen, like I've seen restaurants do this where they put them on top of your drink. But if you make them out of colored paper, they're especially pretty. And then we have lucky stars. So these stars here are, you take a strip of paper, you loop it on itself like a pentagon. And how many of you ever made like one of those paper footballs you flick where you just wrap the paper around? And there's one. Yep. So they're actually super simple to make, take less than a minute. You wrap the paper around itself and then squish it into the star shape. If you're interested in these, you can buy packs of these strips of paper, thousands of strips of paper for like $5 on Amazon. Extremely cheap to get started with those. They're great for like if you're sitting there watching TV and you need to keep your hands busy. Then the last part of strip folding I want to introduce you to is this book in particular, Geometric Origami. It's one of the ones that's down here in the front if you want to take a look at it when we're all done. It's kind of a mix of modular origami and strip folding. These strips of paper are folded into these little shapes. So like here you've got these pentagons and triangles where you fold them into these little pentagons and triangles and then a little hinge sticks them together. So absolutely recommend this book. It's also a great one. Like if you have teenagers you need to buy a Christmas present for, this is spectacular. It's some of the best written instructions I've seen. Strip folding has a lot of different applications. There are people who are pedantic and obnoxious that believe origami should only be a single square of paper folded and never cut, and that's the only thing origami is. Those people are wrong. All right. So money folding. This one, I just really wanted to show you some of these neat models. You've probably seen folks fold dollar bills into stuff before. You might not have seen them fold them into things like dragons and tanks and cameras and fighter jets and pugs and butterflies. There are whole books devoted to just folding money-shaped paper. Very fun. Not really my thing because I prefer to use my money for other stuff, like I guess buying paper. But I quite appreciate that we've spent so much time on just making money prettier. All right. So ikebana, sometimes called oribana in the origami world. Ikebana is the Japanese art of floral arrangement. Oribana is doing this with paper. So here are first examples. This one I wanted to point out in particular because all the models you're going to see on this page, this one in the bottom right here is different. And it's different because it's the only one where the vase and the stem are not made of paper. So there's some overlap in mixed medium stuff, but they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and different styles and are just, there's whole books devoted to ikebana in origami. This work in particular on the top left is from a couple named Yuri and Katrin Shumakov, who we'll talk about in a second as well, because they are prolific artists that I highly recommend checking out. Where are we at? All right, action origami. You've seen this before. If you've ever seen one of these fortune tellers, like you've seen this. Yeah, so this is one of the most basic examples of action origami, along with the jumping frog. This little guy is going to make another appearance later. Don't forget about him. He's one of those, like if you've ever seen those, you just tap on them and then they jump around. This looks a lot like a crane. It's not a crane. This is another really traditional model called the flapping bird. You hold its bottom, the bottom of its base, and you can push it and pull it apart to make it flap its wings. But the most spectacular action origami I want to show you is the work of Yuri and Katrin Shumakov. This book, Magic Mandalas, is also one. I've got a couple of their books here you can take a look at. One of my favorites. These are pretty gigantic projects that span hundreds of modules. And I, on loan, got one of my buddies to give me the thing I had made for him. So here's what these look like. They rotate on themselves, and you can make them in any number of colors and shapes. Yes, they're super, super neat. I just like showing people this. It's one of my favorite things. Towards the end, if you want to come and handle this model, just be extremely, extremely careful. Those are super fun. It's not necessarily beginner friendly, those books are, but very worth it if you want to get into the art form. All right, where are we at now? Tessellations. So here's more where we kind of veer out of representational origami into more geometric, like we're messing with shapes stuff. So tessellations look kind of like this. I've got two of my own up here up front as well. So these are single sheets of paper that have been folded into like really tight grids of sometimes squares, but most of the time triangles, like perfect equilateral triangles. And then in fact, after this, I've got a walkthrough of the steps of a project I made when I was a teenager that'll make it a little more clear how these are put together. This is a single sheet of paper that has been folded into a grid and put into this tessellation form. For those of you who aren't like math folks, tessellations are endlessly repeating patterns. So like you can see in this one here, these squares each form a cell. These triangles each form a cell that just repeats endlessly. You can make them as big or as small as you want. Another example of this is a really large project folded on a hexagonal piece of paper. And then this one I want to bring special attention to because there's a lot of intricacy going on here just beyond just the folding. Paper does not come in colors like that. I am 99% certain that the way this was created, before it was folded into its grid, and the artist had to have known and planned out exactly which triangles on that paper were going to make which parts of the final piece, and then would have treated it with like a watercolor to make it that color before collapsing it down. So tessellations require some of the most mathematical thinking in origami, but even if you're not a mathematical thinker, as long as you're pretty fine detailed, you can access some of these models, absolutely. But if you want to see some neat stuff, Google origami tessellations. So now we're going to walk through a project that I did in my late teens called Clover Folding by Shuzo Fujimoto. Now we start with this small image up here in the back of just this sheet of paper. This is a stuffed panda I had in my teens that was very dear to me that had to be in the picture, I guess. This sheet of paper is on a queen size bed. It's about 3 feet by 3 feet. Really big piece of paper. And it was folded I want to say the grid's like 128 by 128, and it took me 3 hours just to do the pre-creasing. But after the pre-creasing, we start to collapse. So you start in the center, and you collapse down those layers of paper. Here's the back side after the next step was done, and then the front side where we start to see the very first square in the middle form. And then we move on. Here's a little closer view of that middle space. And then we expand a little bit more, a little bit more. Please note my cat's tail up in the top there. How was I supposed to tell him to leave? Here's the back. So the back's a bit messy, especially at this stage. There were points of this project where I remember feeling like, oh no, this isn't going to work. This isn't going to come together. I just wasted the last 10 hours of my life. At the end of this project, it took about 16 hours to complete, but it came together. And here's closer to the end. And all right, so here is the final backside, and the front looks like this. So it is in like complete, it's about this wide across. I really wish I had been able to find where I had it so I could have brought it in because I did not get rid of this. But it really one of the biggest, most complicated things I've ever attempted. And I've strongly considered going back to this particular art form. Super, super fun. Okay, so before we get into really talking about modular origami, which is my favorite thing ever and very much my specialty, we're going to talk about some honorable mentions in things that are adjacent but not quite origami. First, kirigami. So in the same way that origami is to fold paper, kirigami is to cut paper. So sculptures like this are made of cutting and folding paper. This little holiday card, the outline of this is kirigami. It's cut and folded paper, as is the middle. And then this is a like combination of origami and kirigami, cutting these sheets of paper to make these cranes. I have no idea whether this artist cut before or after they folded them. I actually don't know which sounds easier, but those are very, very impressive. And now quilling, excuse me. Quilling falls kind of in the Chinese paper tradition, but it's very close to strip folding. I didn't include it in the strip folding section because it very much deserves its own mention. Here is what quilling looks like. So strips of paper are rolled on themselves. So like these parts of this necklace here are strips that are rolled really, really, really tight and then glued together and then glued to the art surface. So if you look at this part of her headdress here, those aren't wrapped quite as tight. They kind of loosely roll them together and then pinch the edges to make each individual triangle. And this is just one of my absolute favorites. Each individual petal of these flowers is rolled into their own little circle, and then the edges are pinched to make those final shapes. I have two of my favorite quilling books down here if you want to take a look at them. One of them is from a paper folding museum of Chinese origin that is just one of the most beautiful books you'll ever buy. Both of them are also included in that resource guide. So these are some honorable mentions of their paper art that I think really deserves more attention, especially quilling. Okay, so modular origami. This is my specialty. This is the thing I am best at. And it's what you see in front of you today. So very much fold the same thing over and over and over and over again and put them all together. So we're going to start with radial origami. So radial really just means it sits flat. So these stars, they're not one piece of paper. Each point is its own unit that's woven together. There are some books up here as well and in the resource guide that talk about this form specifically. Models like this one are often taken and like people put flowers in them and use them as actual holiday wreaths. This little star here, he's going to make another appearance later. This model specifically is also in the resource guide. It's a super simple one to make and start with. It is great to do with children. So what I recommend though is if you do it with kids, you need to tape the inside so it doesn't fall apart. And then you just let them go nuts. They are going to throw it. When I worked with children and made these, my rule was the second you throw them at each other, I am crushing it in front of your eyes. And every now and again, one didn't believe that I would and learned the hard way, but yes, that's super, super easy to make with even really young kids. So this last piece of radial origami, of the things that are on this page, this one I folded myself. I folded this out of cardstock paper, not cards like scrapbooking paper, which is close to cardstock. Terrible idea. We'll never do it again. Thick. So I wanted to make it as a gift for somebody who was leaving our place of work, and she really loved rainbow themed stuff. And the only way you can get like large rainbow themed paper is scrapbooking paper. It's horrible on your hands. I will never make it again, but goodness gracious, it turned out well. All right. So now we're got a little short story here about golden venture folding. So golden venture units look like this. They're just little triangles with pockets and tabs. So the ship becomes an art form. The name of this form of modular origami is derived from a ship, the Golden Venture, that trafficked people seeking asylum from China to the US. This ship ran aground in 1993. And as a result of a then recent change to US immigration policy, the just under 300 people held within weren't allowed to post bail and instead remained imprisoned, some for as many as 4 years, while waiting for their cases to be decided. This was the start of Bill Clinton's term, and this change that was made was never reversed. It's still what we do to this day. Many of these folks were seeking asylum from what China had then as their one-child policy and the forced sterilizations that went along with it. So while in prison, these people, most of them men, made these models, garnering national attention for both the art form and the struggles of immigrants navigating a broken system. But did it really start in the ship? It may have actually originated in China as part of the Chinese paper folding tradition, Zheji, but the most common story is that this group of immigrants created it while imprisoned. So Zheji, remember back to our friend Lillian Oppenheimer, who chose the word origami. She considered Zheji as the word she would use. But the reason she didn't, very simple, it was too hard to pronounce and spell. So we could have had a completely different term for this. Zheji is a very unique art form in itself in the Chinese paper folding tradition. Highly recommend if you ever have the time to look into it, do so. I really like the word. Chinese is one of the most beautiful spoken languages there is, and we do not do it credit here in the US. Very, very beautiful language. But what did those modules come together to make? Well, they make things like this. These, if you've ever seen this before, you've probably seen the swan. Here's a more complicated version of those swans. Some pop culture figures. So this is like Leia from Star Wars fame, Sokka from a show called Avatar: The Last Airbender. But they're also used to make much larger models like these and like this. So in your resource guide, there's also a link to a full, the American Museum of Art's their retelling of the story of the ship that also includes pictures of some of the models that were made by these immigrants themselves that are currently on display in museums. All right. So another piece of modular origami. So this guy right here, this one is made out of units called the sonobe unit. And the sonobe unit is one of the most important parts of the history of modular origami. It was invented, largely attributed to Mitsunobu Sonobe, but may have been invented by Toshie Takahama. This is that third spot where that idea that maybe he came up with it, maybe he didn't, maybe it's just that he got his name on it first. And why is it important? Because it is the simplest way to get familiar with the shapes and constructions of polyhedral modular origami. So this is an example of what these units can make. Here is a single unit. This 3-unit construction, this guy here is also 3 units, he's just not complete. This 3-unit construction is called Toshie's Jewel after Toshie Takahama. Seems like a bit of a consolation prize when your buddy stole your work, but who knows? You can also make cubes out of 6 units, stuff out of 12 units. There's another cube you can make out of 24. And then this guy, same one we've got there, 30 units. But this particular unit has been varied by a number of artists. It's one of the starting points of most folks' models. So these variants use the same form as a base, and then they just modify it a bit. This one here, I wanted to point out in particular, this one is 270 units folded together. All of the ones in front of you are 30. All of the other ones on this page are 30. And then this guy I wanted to show you just so you can see an example of what crease patterns look like. I am not one of the people that can fold something just from crease patterns, but there are artists that understand the geometry so well, they can just look at this pattern of mountain and valley folds and put these things together. Okay, are we doing on time? All right. So wireframe models we'll very briefly touch. Bariah Loper is not the only person that makes wireframe models, but he is the most famous, prolific artist in this particular form. These models, every color you see here is its own unique shape. And the same shape is repeated over and over and interlocked and woven together. I can't pronounce the names of these models. They include words that are like 30 to 40 letters long, very geometric. If you're interested in these, he's got a book that's full of extremely complex models, but they're also very, very pretty. Okay, so the origin of the most common form of modular origami is the kusudama, which is essentially what you've got in front of you now. So think potpourri. Kusudama originated not as paper, but as bundles of fragrant woods and herbs in a small cloth bag decorated with flowers intended to ward off illness. It comes from the words kusuri for medicine and tama or dama for ball. I could not find clarity on whether it's tama or dama. Many sources say one, many sources say the other. And these showed up hundreds of years before origami did. So this is the most traditional kusudama model. Each of these pieces of paper is its own individual, like each of these petals are its own individual piece of paper. These aren't like the ones you have in front of you. These aren't tabs and pockets. This is just glued. Each of these petals is glued together to make a flower, and then those are glued together to make that larger model. Okay, so this page, unlike many others, are all things that I have folded. So these are kusudama type models. All of these on this page are 30 units, except for this one. This one is 120. These two are both made of the same units. And in your resource guide, you're going to get videos that will show you how to make this one in particular. This is called Rafaelita by an artist named Ekaterina Lukasheva. It's my favorite modular model of all time. And then this one here is called Star Holes by an artist named Francesco Mancini. It's my second favorite of all time. There's also a video tutorial for that one. Okay. All right, so now we get to the last part of our show, my story, and then some casual destruction. We are about 5 minutes from our time. If any of you have to leave, please do not feel bad about leaving early. There is a piece of paper on the very back, at that very back table where you can write your name and email address if you really want me to send you that resource guide so that you don't miss it. All right, so my story starts with the frog, this little guy again. So when I was about 5, my parents sat my brother and I down and told us that they were getting a divorce. I don't remember feeling particularly upset about this. They told us that this wasn't our fault and they absolutely still loved us. And I remember thinking, of course it's not our fault. And of course you do. And later my brother would ask me, do you think this means we get 2 Christmases? And I said, yes, it does. But my parents were thoughtful and thought ahead and took us to a child counselor to kind of help us through what this was going to mean for our lives. And a Child's Place in Longview is where we went. What I remember about a Child's Place is that they had Christmas presents under the tree that were empty boxes of lies, and the only thing the lobby ever played was Enya. I'm not complaining about that. Orinoco Flow is one of the best songs of all time. But the frog, the lady I worked with was named Dr. Gale, and one of the first times I worked with her, she and I folded this frog. Now, having worked with kindergartners before, I know full well I didn't fold that frog by myself, but she made me feel like I did. And I fell in love with it right there. I got obnoxious about it. My parents are right here. They will tell you absolutely that I used every scrap of printer paper. There were times that, thanks mom for the nod there. All the time. I folded napkins in restaurants, all sorts of things. I just fell so in love with it. And then my first real challenge was the lily. This was where I learned, hey, you actually do have to pay really close attention to whether you're turning that diamond around, because this diamond and this diamond aren't the same diamond if you're folding one flap of paper instead of 2. I cried about this silly little flower so many times, crumpled so many pieces of paper, and as many things as I have accomplished in my life, I will still point to figuring that out as one of the absolute most impressive things I've ever done. If you are thinking to yourself like, okay, so you're telling me you started at 5 years old, you folded for 25 years, it's going to take me that long to get good at this. Remember, I didn't have a teacher. I figured it out from books, and it wouldn't be until I was like 12 or 13 and I realized the internet was a thing that I would get more access to information and resources and videos. I taught my younger sister how to make some of these things, and it took her like 2 weeks before she was making the big complicated stuff, and I was so mad. Like 2 weeks? It took you 2 weeks. Okay. So we get to this point where I discover modular origami online. Here are those radial stars again. I made tons of them. And then this cube, this link of interlocking cubes, I didn't immediately jump to the interlocking ones when I was like 12 to 13 years old, but I made plenty of those cubes themselves. So one of the models up here is a different version of those cubes that you can come take a look at. Each of those cubes is 12 units? 12 units. Okay. And then we move on to the Sonobe unit and discovering this form of modular origami. And later I would go on to share it. Before I was Danielle in e-learning here at LCC, I was Danielle who ran the after-school program at Wallace Elementary. And one of my favorite things to do with kids was this, because this, one of the most important things about this model is that the units are super resilient to error. So I could have a kindergartner who messed up nearly every fold and I could still get it to go together in the end. So what I would do was I'd have each of my kids fold 1 or 2 units. And then to my great surprise, there were no behavior issues as they watched me put them together. And then at the end, I toss it up in the air and smack it. And we're going to try that here. I haven't done it in a while, so I apologize if it's a dud, but ha! All right, so to wrap up, before we get to the official Q&A, some questions I know at least one of you has. So first, how long does it take to make one of these? Well, depending on the complexity, anywhere from 2.5 to 6 hours. So you might think all of these models are folded out of squares of paper. They're not all squares. Some of them have really like specific rectangular ratios, like 1 to the square root of 3. There's a book up here called Tamayura. It's all models of paper-sized 1 to the square root of 3. Kind of obnoxious, very worth it. Some of them are like 1 to 5.2. So they're not all squares, and sizing that paper sometimes adds up to like a half an hour of work to the whole process. And then it also just depends on how complicated the module itself is. A model that takes like 1 or 2 minutes to fold a single unit is going to take a whole lot different time than a model that's going to take like 5 minutes to make one. So, and then you have all of the putting them together. So about 2.5 to 6 hours. I'm frequently asked if I sell these or take commissions. For those not familiar with artist speak, take commissions means like, if I ask you to make this specific thing for me, will you? My answer is almost never. I am a firm believer of if you turn the thing you love into a commodity, it's very easy to stop loving it. And I don't want to do that. On special occasions, I've taken commissions. I don't let people pay me for them though. Like I've had a friend whose like father was extremely ill, who loved this color and asked if I could make this thing for them. I love to do stuff like that. I'm not into commercializing this thing that I love. And then finally, will you teach me is when I get a lot. Yeah, but I'm a full-time working adult that's also got a side gig tutoring kids on the weekend. If you are super, super interested, like you want it so bad, my email address is going to be up here in a second. Email me. We can chat about what you might want to learn. Because realistically, if I could teach this full time, that is what I would be doing. But unfortunately, it's not really a financially viable path. But I love it so much. Yeah, I will. Okay. So here is a QR code to that resource guide that I promised and my email address. You can snap a picture of that. But Hakaya, just a second. If your phone can't access it, if you have any trouble with it, again, put your name and email address on that sheet of paper in the back. All right. Thank you for listening to me speed run through this presentation. We are ready for questions. Do you want to do the mic, Courtney? Perfect. All right.
When I'm watching you do this and talk about this, my whole thought is the brain. How what a challenge this is for the brain. You know, if you were slow, I mean, I just think it's you could just go so much farther in with how you do things and mentally just understanding it. And I don't know. I couldn't think about anything else except that this requires some brain thought and some. You know, it's just complicated, but what an exercise it is. So anyway, thank you.
Absolutely.
Oh, and you're from Minnesota?
I am not from Minnesota. My stepfather's from Minnesota, my bonus dad, and
okay.
I stayed with
I
his
was born
family
there,
for a
so
while.
maybe we're family or something. I don't know. Thank you.
Yes. No, origami is the purest combination of math and art there is.
Is it hard to just learn it from a book?
It's not impossible. All of what I learned like all of my first years of doing it, I learned from a book. And that resource,
It's doable.
it's doable. It is absolutely doable. You can absolutely learn it from a book. this resource guide in the book recommendation section. Each of the books I have a little rating next to. If you're really thinking like, nah, I can't do this, look for the ones that have a 1. And because I've rated them from 1 to 3. So there are a couple of them in there that are great for getting started. Yeah.
Hey, Danielle, that was
Hi.
great. You mentioned your favorite modular origami. Can you say why they're your favorite?
Okay, so if I were to go back there. Okay, so my reason this one, Star Holes by Francesco Mancini, is one of my favorites is the folding process itself. It's got some really, really inventive folds in it to make those modules what they are. The modules are these like triangular wedges here that join together at the points. It's just a really, really elegant model. Rafaelita is my favorite though, for much the same reason. The folding structure is really unique and it's kind of fun. These are my favorite modules to fold, like just on their own. The other reason I love this one so much is that its structural integrity is incredibly strong. You will never need adhesive for Rafaelita. Like it is just so woven together that almost untouchably. Like you could do what I did with that and smack it and it would not come apart. It might like crumple a bit, but it's not going to come apart. Which by the way, all of the ones in front of you, I did use adhesive to hold them together. Some folks are like, no, you can't use adhesive for that. And while technically they don't need the adhesive, again, I worked with kids and after the very first time I had a little child like bawling, crying because she broke something I made. I was like, no, I'm just going to put those together because folks like to handle them and that way they don't fall apart. Yes. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much,
Perfect.
Danielle.
Please take the models with you so I can have all sorts of new space to make new stuff.
And join us again next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. All right. Absolutely.